Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program, Korea-China Relations, A History of Intervention. My name is Chelsea Alexander, and I am the Policy Program Officer here at the Korea Society. Today's event marks the opening of the Fall 2025 session of the Kim Koo Professional Series. Established in 2015 with the support of the Kim Koo Foundation, this series celebrates 10 years of impactful programming. In addition to supporting the professional series, the Kim Koo Foundation generously contributed to the Korea Society's flagship policy event, the Van Fleet Policy Forum. Hosted in Washington, D.C. at the Atlantic Council, this year's forum convened leading voices on U.S.-Korea relations to discuss the most pressing issues affecting the alliance. Today's program is live-streamed and available for virtual audiences around the world. In-person attendance is reserved for Kim Koo Fellows only. Fellows will have a special opportunity to interact directly with today's speaker and one another in a roundtable discussion following the recording. For those interested in becoming a Kim Koo Fellow, please email policy@koreasociety.org for more information and to be notified about the Spring 2026 application cycle. We are pleased to open the fall series with a discussion on the Korea-China relationship from both a historical and contemporary perspective. We are very grateful to be joined by Dr. Jiyoung Lee, Associate Professor of International Relations at American University's School of International Service. Thank you for joining us, Professor Lee. Our moderator for today's session is our Policy Director, Jonathan Corrado. So Jonathan, over to you.
Chelsea, thank you so much. Thank you to all our Kim Koo Fellows for joining us today for our very first session in the Fall 2025 series. Professor Jiyoung, thank you for joining us first time at the Korea Society. So welcome. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is your first book right here, China's Hegemony, 400 Years of East Asian Domination. And you're following it up now with a book under contract with Columbia University Press called The Great Power Next Door, which is focusing on China's historic intervention in Korea specifically. Mm-hmm. So I just want to start out by getting a sense for your general interest in this issue, because I find it fascinating, and I hope that you could share it in a way that gets our fellows excited as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It was actually during my time researching for my first book, which was about the international order when China was the sole great power in much of pre-19th century Asia, particularly during the early modern period. I found out that Japan and Korea actually responded very differently to the Chinese-centered hegemonic order from one another and also across time. At one point in late 16th century, Japan actually invaded Korea to conquer China. And this is known as the Imjin War, Hideyoshi invasions of Korea. And I was studying the event, and then I realized that there are striking similarities between Chinese decision to intervene in the Imjin War and Chinese decision to intervene in the Korean War. There were initial hesitation on the part of China, but on both occasions, when maritime power, Japan in late 16th century, and United Nations led by the United States in the 20th century, when their forces came all the way to the northern part of Korean Peninsula near Northeast China, then China actually decided to intervene. So I actually was curious if this is a pattern. So I decided to look at all the instances where China militarily intervened in Korea throughout history to see and whether there is any definitive logic by which China decided to use force in Korea. So that's where I became very interested in actually the role of geography in Sino-Korean relations.
And this is why I like your approach so much, because there's a lot of focus on, there's these two idioms that are used constantly with reference to Korea's geopolitical situation. One is shrimp between whales, which is kind of a mistranslation, right? Because the Korean version is 고래 싸움에 새우가 터진다, which is probably, and correct me when I invariably get this wrong.
That's wonderful.
But when whales fight, the shrimp explodes or its back breaks, right? Different ways of approaching it. And then there's another one that China and North Korea are as close as lips and teeth, but I think the original translation is closer to when the lips are gone, the teeth are cold.
That's right.
Which is a little bit more graphic description, but perhaps more illustrative of the way that China has a realpolitik view. And what your approach does is it gives us a sense for the logic behind how these countries are interacting with one another within that system. So I'm so appreciative of it.
Thank you.
So let's start with the thesis of the new book, which talks about not just why China militarily intervenes, but also in cases when it doesn't, why doesn't it, right? And it's that second part that receives a lot less attention, and why your approach is so valuable. So what are the conditions that have tended to tip China towards war in Korea when we look back at the history?
So actually the short answer is China's strategic interest rooted in geography. You know, in the history of world politics, great powers often deploy their military forces across borders to influence outcomes in particularly less powerful neighbors in the periphery. But then, if geography is unchanging, when did China actually intervene and when it didn't? So the central thesis of my book is that geography is not simply about a physical condition of proximity, size, or location, but it is a social construction. I make an argument that for a very long time, Chinese policymakers have considered the Korean Peninsula, their neighbor, as their fence and gateway for China's own national security. So in this geopolitical vision that China has towards the Korean Peninsula, these were shaped through the historical experiences of war and peace between them, but also through the fusion of realities and mythologies and historical memories. So when you have this, notion that Korea is actually situated at that liminal position of China's inside and out, this is actually tremendous, right? So I actually have looked at many of the diplomatic correspondence between Korean states and Chinese states throughout history. Repeatedly, China describes Korea as China's fence. There are different Chinese characters. There is the screen and the fence, and and also just like what you said, lips to teeth, and also doorstep, gateway. And these metaphors are, they have evolved, but all of them point to this notion that there's some sort of inseparability between, Korean Peninsula and China's safety. So you can imagine that it actually is about what Chinese policymakers have this long-standing belief about the meaning of Korean Peninsula in their own sense of identity of greatness, centrality in Asia, and also vulnerability to external threats. So the foreign policy implication when you have this type of geopolitical vision is that you want to make sure that Korea is not actually influenced by any other rival great powers. So when China did not intervene, you actually have Korea that reify your own identity as the benevolent hegemon, the leader at the center of Asian hierarchy. So in order for you to be that son of heaven, you actually need Korea to be there, right? So that equilibrium of their stable relations throughout much of the history actually bases on the mutual recognition of these identities. But the problem arises when other rival great powers are also interested in influencing and dominating the Korean Peninsula. And we know there are, those historical moments. And those actually happen to be when those interventions take place. So what happens when China is relatively weak vis-a-vis these other great powers, they actually tended to try, use first non-military measures to prevent Korea from becoming a force multiplier of China's rival powers. This is where coercive diplomacy and other forms of non-military measures comes in. But when other great powers, their domination of Korean Peninsula are imminent, that they perceive that, these other rival powers are about to dominate Korean War, Imjin War. That's when they actually militarily intervene in the Korean Peninsula in order to try to restore the status quo ante vis-a-vis these other great powers.
Fascinating. Really terrific approach. I'm reminded when you're talking about the nomenclature that China uses, fans, doorstep, I'm reminded that Xi Jinping said when China was doing a rebranding and a reimagining of its legacy of the Korean War around the 70th anniversary of the start of the war in 2020, opening a bunch of brand new museums, relaunching a bunch of history books. And in Xi Jinping's big speech, he said, 70 years ago, foreign imperialists fired upon the doorstep of a new China, right?
That's right.
And that was a kind of language. It was more confrontational than China's previous version, which was a focus on the socialist brethren narrative.
I see.
And kind of just hiding the real reasons for it. What was this real pressing security threat? So yeah, very much in line.
Well, I'm glad you have that exact relevance to what I was talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So there are a couple little conventional wisdoms that your new book is looking to re-examine. Can you talk to us about what those are and why we should maybe take another look at them?
Sure. I don't know how many of you here are international relations major, but there's a tendency that assume that China's growing capability is the same as China's intention to dominate the entire world. I do not know if that's their intention, but I think my book actually encourages the reader to have a little more nuanced approach. What actually matters is interests and identity as well as power. So, I look at history and try to understand their historical consciousness. I think it's important to understand, to Chinese policymakers and everyday Chinese, what is something that feels natural to them? What do they take for granted in their relationship with the neighbor called Korea? Only then I think we can understand these big questions about what Chinese likely responses are going to be about the unification of the two Koreas, what's likely Chinese responses to North Korean contingencies, or why is it that China seems very reluctant to put pressure on Pyongyang when North Korea is actually acting very, provocative manner with its nuclear test and whatnot? So that's one that I wanted to really us to understand. First and foremost, what is it that the other side is trying, and what is natural, feels natural to them, and then go from there, that's strategic calculations. And then the second thing is about Korea. Jonathan, you kind of referenced to this. There is a very popular and prevailing discourse about Korea having been invaded 900 times throughout their history. At one point, I saw it in the State Department website. It's in peer-reviewed scholarly articles, policy think tanks. Bloggers talk about it. I mean, it's everywhere. It's being reproduced continuously. But my book actually suggests, well, if you actually include every pirate raid, then you're actually only going to make Korea stuck. And the narrative is Korea is stuck, in between great powers because of its geography. It's been invaded 900 times. So what this book tries to do is, based on intense consultation with historians and also using social science methodology and defining terms, clearly, and I, differentiate between military intervention and the war, right? And I actually have 4 bundles of cases of military intervention, and actually 3 of which were at the request of Korean government at that time. So, I just really want us to be mindful that when we actually really study history, these popular discourse may not necessarily may be misleading and actually perpetually assign Korea this image and the identity of a victim of great power politics. So that's what I'm trying to challenge as well.
Terrific. So nuanced. And we're at a time where that's needed. So let's go through these 4 historical periods. And I think this helps us present an interesting narrative and start to see some of the patterns more specifically. So we could start with the Sui and Tang invasions, 6th and 7th century.
Okay. So, when Sui Empire unified China in late 16th century, I like to always start with the big picture. That actually ended some 300 years of disunity in Chinese history. And, after the fall of the Han Empire. And since then, China actually has never experienced such a protracted division since. So, this unification of Sui Empire precedes its interventions in Goguryeo. So there's this one historian that talks about how Sui and Tang interventions in Goguryeo really was about this issue of defining what was part of China and what was not part of China, right? Because this is ancient history, documents are less than the later part of history. And historians actually offer different interpretations as to why Sui and Tang intervened militarily in Goguryeo. But what I see as the common theme, and from the perspective of this study of China-Korea relations, what was really crucial is the territory that Goguryeo occupied. It's actually the Liaotong and the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. This, historians typically regard this period as the starting point of interstate relations, and this is where my book actually starts. This, Liaotong, peninsula, that area, Manchuria, northeast China is, in fact, a key in terms of China's sense of stability and security. So, there's this Goryeo official on the Korean Peninsula who wrote this history book called 삼국사기. He actually talks about Goguryeo history and then describe that Goguryeo occupied the territory, and that was a land with many fears. 두려움이 많은 땅에 위치했다, right? And he goes on to describe how this Liaotong area is where heroes arise, fighting with one another for greater authority. So it actually has to do with the territory that Goguryeo occupied. And when you actually read the official Chinese history, 신탕슈, Tang Emperor Taichung, who is regarded as one of the 3 great, Chinese emperors in Chinese history, actually remarked to his ministers. I'm going to read it's my translation from Korean text, and it says, "Now all the known world has been brought under Tang's control, but only Goguryeo, Liaotong, is yet to be subdued. So for Tang Empire and Sui Empire to build a Chinese-centered order in the region, the fact that Goguryeo remained right there as a defiant and powerful actually created a sense of insecurity, and that actually has to do with their military intervention. And it also had to do with the meaning that this territory, land, Liaotong had, they very much, Sui and Tang emperors very much wanted to restore the glory of the former Han Empire with Liaotong as part of that glory. One of the other things that I found fascinating about this episode is that, again, Tang Emperor Taichung is, really respected by later Chinese. And after the fall of Goguryeo, actually, Taichung's failure to conquer Goguryeo became part of imperial imaginations for successive Korean states. And this is actually one of the things that historian Su Wang talks about. So if you actually read a book by Joseon official later in the 15th century, Chebu, in his essay Pyohero, so he was drifted away and actually ended up landing in Ming. So there's a dialogue between Chebu and Ming official, and this Ming official asked Chebu, how was it possible that your country was able to, repel great Sui and Tang emperors? So meaning that there's this historical memory of earlier episodes of, Tang Taichung's failure to conquer Goguryeo became part of their historical consciousness. So before I actually end this episode, when we actually think about this particular time period, this is the time when Korean Peninsula was divided into 3 kingdoms, right? Goguryeo, Baekje, Silla. And several historians actually talk about how their decision to intervene is to prevent Goguryeo that's already occupying that, northeast, the Liaotong area. If Goguryeo, in their competition with the other 2 Korean kingdoms, Baekje and Silla, occupy the entire Korean Peninsula and become that defiant and powerful state right there, it's not going to be very comforting. So when we think about, what are the terms under which China will be okay with the unification of the 2 Koreas, right? So that actually is not necessarily direct application, but sheds some light on the sense of security and security, particularly with this, particular land in Liaotong. Yes.
Super interesting. Okay, and now we're just going to fast forward a little bit forward in history, just about 1,000 years, and go to Ming China's intervention in the Imjin War.
Mm-hmm. So about Imjin War, again, I'd like to talk about the big history. Did you actually think about, when you look at the history of Asian international relations, the 2 major powers, China and Japan, it's rare that we saw both of them were great powers simultaneously in the history of Asian international relations, right? And I would say there are about 2 times. One is actually right now in the 21st century, when in 2010, China became number 2 world economy, surpassing Japan. So they're both, major great powers. Another is actually late 16th century when Japan under Hideyoshi, after Oda Nobunaga, there's 3 unifiers in Japanese history. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was able to unify daimyos of the 66 provinces, so Japanese military power really grew. And when we actually think about the significance of, Hideyoshi invading Korea, actually is Japan's rise of Japan directly challenging then Ming Chinese-centered international order, and them coming into conflict with one another. And this is what happens when Japan had ambition towards Asian continent in China, and what happened to Korean Peninsula right there as the bridge, right? So Japanese forces were able to quickly go to Pyongyang. Busan fell the next day. And went all the way to Pyongyang very quickly. On that same day, Ming actually sent 3,000 men, as the first round of troops. And Ming at that time was actually engaged in another campaign. So they were not super looking forward to, engage with the Japanese. But in terms of, Im Jin-woo, I just wanted to share some things that I read from a very interesting book. It's actually written by Sung Chang, who was military commissioner appointed by the Ming Emperor then. He has this book called The Essentials for Reviving the Country by a Military Commissioner. And he quotes Minister of War, who wrote, "During the Sui and Tang periods, we, Ming and Joseon, dealt with each other like shield and spear. Yet, over the past 200 years, while enjoying the imperial benevolence, Ming Emperor, Korea is not merely a subject that did not betray or invade. In truth, the country has been defending China like a fence and wings." So again, the same notion. And, when you actually look at the official Mingshi, the discussions within the Ming court debating what to do with Korean situation after Japanese invaded, it actually states the opinion within the Ming court was that Ming troops should fight in Joseon, where a conflict took place, because Joseon, quote, plays the role of a fence to China. So again, that same notion right there. So, when we talk about Im Jin-woo, this is also a time period where we can see, if you actually think about it, Korean state was right there next to China, and there's a power asymmetry and geographic proximity. But Korea was not annexed to part of China, but ideas will surface. But it tended to be when China was weak and struggling vis-a-vis other great powers. So it was against this backdrop, Sun Gwang in 1594 and 1597, again, around the Im Jin War against the Japanese, he recommended to the Ming court that, Ming China should establish an administrative units in Pyongyang and Kaesong and observe Korean Peninsula as part of Ming. And then when the Manchus were rising, when Ming was also really in difficult situation militarily, another Ming official, Li Chongliang, also suggested that Joseon should be part of China, but these were not materialized. So it never actually put in place or implemented. Yes.
Okay, so starting to get some themes here. And let's see how they continue. 19th century, a time of some upheaval on the Korean Peninsula.
So again, the big picture here is 19th century when Qing intervened in Joseon. These are the final days of Joseon dynasty. You guys probably are familiar. It was the most turbulent time periods, one of the most turbulent time periods in world history. And so far the Chinese-centered tributary system, where China was at the top of Asian hierarchy, was crumbling. And it was the arrival of Western imperial powers. So the topics of the day was international law, imperialism, industrialization, and nation building. And Korea ended up being that contested, site of all these great power politics. So Li Hongjiang actually wrote in one of his documents that this is a situation unprecedented since the beginning of the time, So you can imagine how there was just tremendous transformation and confusion there must be. And, many of you may have heard about the century of humiliation. This is that time period that we're talking about. So China actually intervened militarily in Joseon due to, in response to internal instabilities within Korea, Imo incident of 1882, Kapsin uprising of 1884, and Tongwak uprising of 1894. As we all know, after, Donghak actually led to the first Sino-Japanese War, after which China was no longer the leading power of Asia. So, it was really interesting to see how China during this time would embrace Western tactics, and a lot of historians actually characterize especially Qing Chinese behavior from 1880 towards Joseon as Qing imperialism. There's a whole literature out there. But at the same time, they actually really asserted towards Joseon Koreans about their identity as the son of heaven, and actually used that ideological tool to try to control Korean behavior. So again, let me read the official dynastic history of Qing Shigao. When a fence is torn down, the entire house is at risk. When a foreign power pressures a country, it fosters internal divisions. Thus, a tributary state on China's periphery becomes a pressing national security issue. It is the duty of the Son of Heaven to protect its tributary states, ensuring their safety and stability. So, to summarize, Qing during this time actually used three strategies. One is called using barbarians to counter barbarians. So what you see in this document, I'm sure you cannot really read it well, is Li Hongjiang wanted to start off using United States against Russian and Japanese ambitions. So this document, which is the first document that Korea, Joseon, had with a Western power, this is the Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce and Navigation between the United States and Korea, May 22, 1882. This actually was not because Koreans were super excited from the get-go. It was tremendous efforts and persistent, urging on the part of Chinese diplomats based on this strategy of using barbarians to counter other barbarians. So this is the diplomatic strategy. So if you actually,
the U.S. to counter Japan.
Yes. Actually, if you look at the strategy for Korea, Hwang Junxian wrote very favorably about the United States.
Wow.
United States does not covet others' land or people, so we can trust the United States. It was that sentiment. When you think about this question from the 21st century perspective, it's kind of interesting because U.S. South Korea, U.S.-Korea alliance, it's a very important, part of U.S.-China competition, at least from the U.S. point of view. So actually, if you look at the language, there shall be perpetual peace and friendship between the President of the United States and King of Joseon and the citizens and subjects of their respective governments. If other powers deal unjustly or oppressively with either government, the other will exert their good offices on being informed of the case to bring about an amicable arrangement, thus showing their friendly feelings. So Li Hongjiang was hoping and expecting to use the good offices from the United States government. But he soon realizes that that's not going to work. The other strategy is to really use Qing's relationship to basically political intervention. You probably have heard the name Wen Shikai, who became the minister, resident minister. Basically, he was trying to control King Gojong and other aspects of Joseon internal politics at that time. And the third strategy actually was the military intervention. And we all know that how that ended with the first Sino-Japanese War.
So interesting. So another time when the fence, China's perception of the Korean Peninsula, would come under question is, of course, the Korean War.
That's right.
Which is probably the episode that most of our audience is familiar with, and I think pretty neatly adheres to the pattern that you've been laying out for us.
Right. When Chinese army crossed the Yalu River the night of October 19th, 1950, it was after a lot of internal discussions and, I would say some back and forth. And Mao Zedong actually really tried to persuade, and you probably know much better than I am, persuade, his comrades the strategic necessity of participating in the Korean War. Basically, Mao Zedong said it's inevitable that we're going to have to go to war with the United States. Then it's strategically preferable to fight on the Korean Peninsula than in Taiwan or Indonesia. That's what Mao actually, thought. So, for Korean War, which is very well researched and, evolving, I would like to highlight just two things. One, Korean War actually became part of later China's geopolitical vision actually towards Korea, but also, U.S. alliance network, U.S. forces, right? And when you read Henry Kissinger's book on China, he talks about how when President Truman sent U.S. Navy to the Taiwan Strait after North Korea invaded South, to Mao Zedong, it was United States was re-entering the Chinese Civil War. So that actually had a lot of implications in shape the ways in which Chinese actually look at U.S. actions in Asia. That's one that I wanted to highlight. And second is there's this telegram that Zhou Enlai sent to Soviet government. This is December 7, 1950. So this is about 2 months after they joined the war, about military operations in Korea will be ended under the following conditions. So if you actually understand under what conditions China will actually withdraw its forces, there are 6, but if I may read the 3. 1, withdrawal of all foreign troops from Korea. And this is what China will be okay with, right, on the Korean Peninsula. 2, the withdrawal of American troops from the Taiwan Strait and from the territory of Taiwan. And 3, the Korean question must be resolved by the Korean people themselves. So this suggests a clue as to what China's enduring, geopolitical vision is towards Korean Peninsula, especially this part about withdrawal of foreign troops, basically away from the Korean Peninsula, which still is, I think, very relevant. And lastly, about Korean War, Zhou Enlai also said, quote, the Chinese government has thought and does think that withdrawal of foreign troops from Korea is the key to accomplishment of the peaceful reunification of Korea by the Korean people themselves through negotiations, etc., etc. So, actually, I have a section where I look into contemporary today's Chinese scholars' discussions about, unification of the two Koreas. It's very much about U.S. forces in Korea that they care about. So, in terms of discourse analysis, there is an acknowledgement that it's a reality that could happen, in that scholarly literature. But some will argue that unification will be great for China, then U.S. probably will be gone, and others will say, if we have a Korean Peninsula unified and then still alive with the United States, that's not going to be very, very good for China. So that I have, I at least in my mind, there's a consistent pattern, concerns about rival great power, their forces on the Korean Peninsula. Yes.
What struck me is how after China's invasion, Truman releases a statement saying the United States is surprised by this based on the historic friendship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And then China releases a statement saying, you've always been our enemy. Here's all the ways that you've wronged China historically. And so this overestimation, over-attribution of hostility from the perspective of China about America's designs to imperially dominate Asia, that was inflated, right? And then this underestimation by the part of the Truman administration to perceive how their actions would would be perceived by China, and
Right.
specifically sending the Seventh Fleet into the Taiwan Strait after it had taken so many strides to strike a conciliatory tone, even going as far as giving up Taiwan, right? Prior to that, and then it's okay to change policy, right? But you should know how it impacts your adversary. And this was a case where there wasn't an understanding of how China's security interests were affected by that. Okay.
Yeah, Korea has a big implications for U.S.-China relations.
And that's where we're going to land.
Okay.
And then after this, we get a chance to go into the boardroom with all the fellows who are here in person. And then it's your time to shine. And we'll hear from your perspective, your comments, and your questions. So looking forward to that. So where we're going to land is, how do we apply those lessons to today? And I want to quote something that you wrote in a Rand piece about the contemporary relationship. China's policies towards South Korea are a function of its ambitions vis-a-vis the United States. But if it's true that contemporary geopolitics has, shall we say, unique qualities, then are there limitations to how we can apply these historical lessons?
Yes. Let me actually start with the relevance of my historical work for contemporary. I think my study of historical patterns really urges us to pay attention to the China and U.S. alliance network in Asia, especially against the backdrop of the relative basically shifting power balances and the strategic rivalry between Beijing and Washington. So, I actually see China's approach to the Korean Peninsula, prior to the 19th century and today, I actually see a striking continuity. And one, I think the more intensified the competition between United States and China becomes, China's Korea policy will likely to be increasingly conditioned by Beijing's competition with the United States. And when you actually read Chinese scholars, Chinese language scholarly articles and whatnot, China actually believes that U.S. alliances with its Asian powers is a tool for United States to compete against China. And previously in the past decades, China was avoiding challenging, say South Korea's and Japan's alliance relationship with the United States, and with focusing on economic engagement and with the long-term goal of having influence later. But it actually has shifted. So if you actually look at what happened to South Korean deployment of anti-missile system THAAD, that decision in 2016, and China's use of economic sanctions, it's very much part of this big picture. It's actually not really about South Korea per se. It's actually the concern that China has about South Korea becoming the force multiplier of U.S. alliance network, because during the Obama administration, missile defense system was very much to regionalize and emphasizing the interoperability between these allies, moving away from this hub and spoke system. My sense is that the more intense the competition between Beijing and Washington, I think Beijing is going to really try to keep very good relations with Pyongyang as a form of insurance policy. So you can actually see this dynamic a little bit when Kim Jong-un has summit meetings with U.S. President Trump. You actually see Kim Jong-un and President Xi Jinping have their meetings too. And this pattern actually shows during the Cold War when China was in Sino-Soviet competition split as well. And but the limits are many. But I actually have this one of my favorite quote as someone who does historical work, but also think a lot about policy relevance. So if it's okay, I'm gonna read again. I like this quote, and I like to end with these words by John Lewis Geddes. History is not like mathematics and chemistry, where the repeated combination of variables in the same amounts and under the same conditions will always produce the same results. It certainly is not, in and of itself, a guide for the future. Those who sought to use history in this way, by assuming that the future will replicate the past, can count on only two certainties, which are that it will not and that they will be surprised as a consequence. So, with that.
Great note to end on. Thank you so
Yes.
much, Professor Jian Lee. Please help me to thank our wonderful speaker today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining.
Great job. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. So we're gonna meet. Why don't we take a quick 5-minute break? So it's 4:49 right now. Let's plan to be all settled in the boardroom, which is right back that way, by 4:55. So the bathrooms are right over there by the elevator. Get to know your neighbors. Maybe you want to bring some of that stuff, including the participant sheet, so you can kind of see who else is here and get a chance to meet with them. And we'll see you shortly in the boardroom.